It seems like everywhere you turn these days, someone's talking about companies and the whole environment thing.
Yeah, definitely feels like it's really having a moment, right?
Between regulators and investors, everybody wants to know what companies are doing.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not just some random trend. It all ties back to those big global goals,
Right.
like the UN's Sustainable Development Goals, the ones for the environment.
Yeah. Yeah.
So when a company says they're green these days,
Mm-hmm.
it feels like it actually means something,
It's definitely more than just good PR now.
for sure.
Okay.
So that actually leads perfectly into what we're diving into today.
Okay.
We've got this fascinating research paper.
Oh, yeah.
It's called Green Innovation and Corporate Default Risk.
Interesting.
And it tackles this big question.
Okay.
How does a company's focus on green innovation?
So like new technologies.
Right, exactly. Or, just smarter ways of doing things that make their environmental footprint smaller.
Right.
How does that actually affect how financially healthy they are?
Oh, that's a good question.
And specifically, their risk of going belly up,
Mm-hmm.
which is what's called corporate default risk.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that's the big fear for any business, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So let's break down corporate default risk for a second.
Okay.
For anyone listening, that basically means
Yeah.
the chance that a company can't pay its debts.
Can't meet their financial obligations, right?
Exactly. Now, you might be thinking, why should I care about that?
It does sound kind of technical.
It does, but it's actually super important for a few reasons.
Yeah, for sure.
If you're like a company manager, it's all about managing risk smartly.
Mm-hmm.
Knowing what makes your business more or less stable is huge.
It's essential.
Totally. And if you're an investor,
Right.
it helps you figure out which companies are solid bets and which ones might be heading for trouble.
Makes sense.
And then zooming out even further for policymakers, it's about making sure the whole financial market is stable.
Right. Because if a ton of companies start defaulting,
Oh, yeah.
that can have a domino effect.
Yeah, for sure. So what did this research actually find? What's the big takeaway?
Well, and the main finding is pretty clear.
Okay.
Companies that are more committed to green innovation generally have a lower risk of defaulting here in the U.S.
That's interesting.
And they looked at a massive amount of data to figure this out.
Oh, wow.
Over 15,000 observations from more than 2,300 companies between 2003 and 2020.
So they weren't messing around?
No, they really went deep.
Okay, so that's a serious chunk of the market over a pretty long period of time.
Yeah, they really wanted to get a solid picture.
And the trend held up.
It did. Pretty consistently.
Wow, that's impressive. Okay, so how did they actually measure this risk of a company defaulting?
Right. Good question.
What kind of tools did they use?
Well, they use 3 main ways to measure default risk.
Okay,
All of them are pretty standard in this kind of research.
gotcha.
The first one's called distance to default.
Distance to default.
Yeah, it's a little bit of a mouthful.
Yeah.
But think of it like a car driving towards a cliff edge.
Okay, I can picture that.
A higher distance to default means the car's further away from going over.
Gotcha. So further from disaster.
Exactly. It's based on market data and basically looks at how far a company's assets are from the point where they'd probably default.
So higher is better?
Exactly. Higher means less risk.
Okay, what's the second measure?
The second one's called probability of default.
Okay, pretty straightforward.
Yeah, it's exactly what it sounds like.
So basically, how likely is it that a company will default within a certain time period?
Right. On the money. Lower is better here, obviously.
Makes sense.
And the third measure they used is CDS spreads.
CDS spreads.
Yeah, it stands for credit default swap.
Right.
But you can think of the spreads like an insurance premium.
Okay, following you.
Someone pays that premium to protect themselves if a company defaults on its debt.
Okay.
So a lower premium means the insurer thinks the company is less risky.
And the market overall probably agrees with that assessment. Got it. So higher distance to default, lower probability of default, and lower CDS spreads.
Yep.
That's the financial picture that comes with being more innovative in a green way.
That's the connection they found.
Now, the paper digs into some theories behind this connection, right?
They do.
Like, why is this happening?
Right. They wanted to understand what's driving this relationship.
So what's the first theory they looked at?
The first one is instrumental stakeholder theory.
Instrumental stakeholder theory. Okay.
The idea is that when companies are seen as environmentally responsible, through things like investing in green innovation,
Right.
they're generally viewed more favorably by key stakeholders.
That's stakeholder, so that's like...
Investors, customers, even regulators.
Gotcha.
And that positive perception can have real benefits.
Yeah, like what?
Like a stronger brand, easier access to capital, maybe fewer regulatory hurdles.
That makes sense.
All of that can lead to more stable cash flow and ultimately a lower risk of default.
So being green basically makes you more popular in the business world.
It can definitely help.
And that popularity leads to a better financial situation.
That's what the theory suggests.
Interesting. Okay, what's the other theory they explore?
The second one is all about information asymmetry.
Okay.
The basic idea here is that companies who are actively doing green innovation, they tend to be more transparent about their operations overall.
So they're more open about what they're doing.
Right. They're more likely to share information, including their environmental efforts.
Cool.
And this transparency reduces uncertainty for investors and lenders.
Makes sense.
When they have a clearer picture of what a company's up to, they feel more confident.
Right, less risk.
Exactly. Less mystery equals less financial worry.
I like that. Okay, so we got the headline, Green Innovation Lowers Default Risk.
Yep.
And we've got some initial ideas about why that might be.
Uh-huh.
Now, let's really get into the nitty-gritty of the findings.
All right, let's dive in.
You mentioned that companies with higher green innovation scores,
Right.
they showed lower default risk across all three of those measures.
Yep, that's right.
Can you give us a more concrete sense of what that link looks like?
Sure. So the study found a statistically significant and consistent correlation.
Okay.
Companies that scored higher on green innovation. And those scores were specifically about their ability to develop products or processes that help their customers be more environmentally friendly.
Oh, interesting. So it's not just about their own internal practices.
Right. It's about how their innovations impact their customers, too.
Got it.
Anyway, those companies consistently showed a greater distance to default, lower probability of default, and lower CDS spreads.
Like we talked about earlier.
Exactly.
And they actually put some numbers to this, didn't they?
They did. They quantified the effect.
Okay, how so?
They found that a 1 standard deviation increase in their green innovation score actually increased the distance to default by 0.11 points.
Not bad.
And it reduced the probability of default by a pretty significant 5.5%.
Oh, wow. That's not nothing.
Right. And to be clear, 1 standard deviation is a statistical term.
Yeah.
But in real-world terms, it basically means a substantial increase in a company's green innovation efforts.
So a noticeable change.
Right. And a 5.5% reduction in the probability of default, that can be a big deal for investors and creditors who are trying to assess risk.
For sure. Those aren't small numbers. Now, I bet some people listening are thinking, wait a minute, isn't all this focus on being green just a big expense? Doesn't it drain resources from a company's main business?
That's a common concern.
The paper mentions this idea of an overinvestment theory.
Right.
What's the worry there?
So the overinvestment theory basically suggests that companies might go overboard with green innovation.
Okay.
They might spend too much and divert resources.
Resources like?
Money, time, talent.
Right.
And the theory is that this could actually hurt their core business activities.
Oh, so it could backfire.
Potentially. And that could actually make them more likely to default, not less.
Because they're spreading themselves too thin.
That's the idea.
And the argument is that some of these green investments, they might be driven more by external pressures or even just management's personal interests.
Yeah, sometimes it's more about looking good than making sound financial decisions.
Right. So it's like a feel-good exercise that could end up hurting the company financially.
It's a valid concern.
But this research suggests that's not really the case, right?
That's right. The findings actually support those other theories we talked about.
Okay.
The instrumental stakeholder theory and the idea of reducing information asymmetry.
So those seem to hold more weight.
Yeah, the evidence points in that direction.
It looks like the benefits of being green.
Right. Things like better relationships with stakeholders and more transparency. Those benefits seem to outweigh any potential downsides of overinvesting in green initiatives.
At least when it comes to the risk of defaulting.
Exactly. That seems to be the key takeaway.
Okay, that's important to understand. Yeah. Now, the study also looked at how different factors within a company might affect this whole relationship between green innovation and default risk.
Oh, yeah, they went pretty deep.
Let's start with who owns the company.
Okay.
Specifically, institutional ownership.
Interesting area.
How does that play into all of this?
So this is where it gets really fascinating.
I'm all ears.
Institutional investors, like
player.
pension funds, insurance companies, huge investment firms.
Right, the ones with deep pockets.
Exactly. And they tend to have a longer-term outlook than some other investors.
Okay.
They often pay close attention to things like how well a company is run and its sustainability practices.
They're not just in it for a quick buck.
Right. They're looking at the bigger picture.
So what did the research find about them?
Well, they found that the positive impact of green innovation on lowering default risk, it was actually stronger in companies with a higher percentage of institutional ownership.
Oh, interesting. So it's like having those big investors on board amplifies the effect.
It seems that way.
Why might that be? What's the connection?
Well, there are a few likely reasons.
Okay.
First off, these institutional investors.
Yeah.
They have the resources and the expertise to really dig into a company's green initiatives.
So they can tell if a company is actually doing good work.
Right. They can spot greenwashing a mile away.
That's important.
Yeah. And this oversight helps ensure that green investments are actually effective.
And not just for show.
Exactly. It helps make sure those initiatives are baked into the company's core strategy.
Okay, that makes sense.
What else? Well, second, because of their size and influence, these institutional investors, they're often better positioned to help companies get the capital they need.
To actually implement these green innovations.
Exactly. They can open doors that might be closed to companies without that kind of backing.
So it's not just about scrutiny, it's about support too.
Right. It's a more holistic involvement.
Interesting. And is there a third reason?
Yeah. The third reason is more about perception.
Perception. Okay.
When a company has a lot of ownership from reputable institutional investors, that sends a positive signal to the market.
So it's like a vote of confidence.
It is. It boosts confidence in the company's stability and its long-term prospects.
Which can indirectly lower the perceived default risk.
Exactly. It's all connected.
And so having those big, serious investors involved seems to encourage more meaningful green innovation.
It does seem that way.
And it also amplifies the positive effects on the company's financial stability.
Right. It's a win-win.
Very cool. Okay, what about the age of a company? Does a young startup experience this differently than a well-established company?
That's another great question, and the study definitely suggests there's a difference.
Okay, tell me more.
So younger firms, while they might not have as many resources as older companies...
Right, they're still scrappy.
Exactly. But they can potentially see even bigger benefits from green innovation.
Especially when it comes to reducing the risk of default.
Right, because they're often more flexible.
Okay.
They're not tied to old technologies or ways of doing things.
They can adapt more quickly.
Exactly. They can be quicker to adopt new, greener technologies, and they can build their brand around environmental consciousness right from the start.
That makes sense. They're starting with a clean slate.
Right. So it's kind of like fresh and adaptable versus and maybe a bit more resistant to change.
Like set in their ways?
Yeah, exactly. And the research actually found a more significant decrease in default risk. Associated with green innovation for those younger firms.
Compared to the older, more established companies.
Right. It seems those older firms, despite having more money sometimes, they can face what's called organizational inertia.
Organizational inertia, what's that?
It's basically entrenched processes and a reluctance to change the way things are done.
So it's harder for them to pivot.
It can be, and that can make it harder for them to really get the full benefits of green innovation.
So it's not just about having the money, it's about being willing to adapt.
Exactly. Flexibility is key.
That makes a lot of sense. It's often easier to build something green from the ground up.
It can be.
Than to try and change a system that's already in place.
That's a great way to put it.
Okay, now let's talk about something that's a big issue for some industries. Carbon intensity.
Right. The elephant in the room for some.
How does the amount of carbon a company emits? How does that affect this whole relationship between green innovation and default risk?
So this is a really important point. And the study dug specifically into how a company's carbon intensity plays a role.
Okay, what did they find?
Well, they found that for companies, industries that are carbon intensive.
Like what kind of industries?
Think fossil fuels, heavy manufacturing, transportation.
Okay, yeah, those are the big ones.
Right. For those companies, green innovation isn't just a nice thing to do.
It's more crucial for them.
It can be a matter of survival. They face stricter environmental regulations, and they have huge financial risks tied directly to their emissions.
Like what kind of risks?
Well, things like potential carbon taxes or penalties for exceeding emission limits.
Oh yeah, those can be huge.
They can be make or break for some companies.
So for them, investing in green innovation isn't just about being a good corporate citizen.
Right. It's about protecting themselves.
It's about avoiding a potential financial hit down the road.
Exactly. It's a strategic necessity.
Makes sense. So what did the research show about these carbon-intensive companies?
Well, they found that the reduction in default risk that companies achieved through green innovation, it was even more pronounced in firms with those heavier carbon footprints.
So the higher the stakes, the bigger the potential payoff.
That's what the data suggests.
Interesting. Now, whenever we look at these kinds of connections in research, the question always comes up, is this really cause and effect?
Right. Correlation doesn't equal causation?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Could it be that companies that are already financially stable, are they just the ones who can afford to invest in green innovation?
That's always a possibility.
Instead of the green innovation itself being the thing that's making them less risky.
Right. We have to be careful about jumping to conclusions.
The paper addresses this whole idea of endogeneity.
Right. They do. They're very thorough about it.
Okay, so how did they make sure that the relationship they were seeing wasn't just due to some other hidden factor?
So they used a bunch of fancy statistical techniques to try and isolate the true effect of green innovation.
Gotcha. So like what kind of techniques?
Well, one thing they did was look at the impact of past green innovation on current default risk.
So looking back in time.
Exactly. They used what are called lagged variables.
Lagged variables.
It's basically like checking to see if a company's past green efforts predict how healthy they are financially today.
Like seeing if there's a delayed effect.
Right. And they also use something called firm fixed effects to filter out any characteristics of individual companies that might be skewing the results.
So controlling for any quirks specific to each company.
Exactly. They wanted to make sure they were isolating the effect of the green innovation itself.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Those sound like good ways to try and zero in on the true impact of those green efforts.
They're pretty standard methods for dealing with this kind of problem.
Okay, what about those other methods you mentioned?
Right. So they also use a technique called propensity score matching.
Propensity score matching. Okay.
It sounds complicated, but it's basically about creating comparison groups.
Comparison groups. Okay.
They find companies that are similar in a lot of ways, but different in their levels of green innovation.
So they can compare apples to apples.
Right. And that lets them more accurately assess the impact of that difference in green innovation.
Clever. What else?
They also used instrumental variables, which is a way of finding an external factor that influences a company's green innovation efforts, but doesn't directly affect its default risk in other ways.
So like a separate but related factor.
Exactly. In this case, they used the average level of green innovation in a company's industry.
Okay. So they're looking at the industry as a whole.
Right. And they're assuming that a company's own green innovation is influenced by what its competitors are doing.
That makes sense.
But that the overall industry average wouldn't directly impact a company's risk of default.
Except through its influence on that company's own green efforts.
Right.
Okay, I'm following you. And was there one more technique?
One more. They also did a difference in differences analysis.
Okay, that one sounds familiar.
It's a pretty common method.
So what's the idea behind that one?
Well, they basically looked at how the relationship between green innovation and default risk changed around a major event.
A major event.
Like the 2015 Paris Climate Accord.
Okay, I see.
Because that agreement might have pushed more companies to focus on green initiatives.
It definitely put a spotlight on the issue.
It did. And by comparing how things changed before and after that event, they could get a better sense of whether the agreement itself had an impact.
Smart. So they really threw the whole statistical toolbox at this.
They did. They wanted to be as rigorous as possible.
And what was the overall result after all those checks?
Well, the main finding held up across all of those analyses.
That's reassuring.
It is. Higher green innovation was consistently linked to lower corporate default risk.
So that strengthens the argument that there's a real cause and effect relationship here.
Exactly. It's not just random chance or some other hidden factor.
Okay, so we've established that there's a link. Now let's dig into how green innovation might actually be lowering that risk.
Yeah, let's get into the mechanics.
The paper suggests that it works by reducing overall firm risk.
That's right.
Can you unpack that a bit?
Sure. So the researchers looked at the mechanisms, the ways in which green innovation might make a company less risky overall. And one key way they found evidence for is that green innovation seems to lead to lower cash flow volatility.
So their income is more stable.
Exactly. Companies that are more innovative in a green sense tend to have more predictable and reliable income streams.
They're not as vulnerable to sudden ups and downs.
Right. And that makes it much easier for them to manage their debts and meet their financial obligations.
So it's less of a financial roller coaster and more of a steady climb.
That's a great way to put it. More stability, less risk.
What was another way they found green innovation might reduce risk?
Well, they also looked at the idea that a company's reputation can be enhanced by strong environmental performance.
Okay, so being seen as green can actually improve a company's image.
Right, and a better reputation.
Yeah.
It can actually influence how much risk management is willing to take on.
Oh, interesting. So it affects their decision-making?
It can. It might lead them to favor more stable, lower-risk strategies.
Because they have more to lose.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They don't want to jeopardize their good name.
Makes sense. So how do they actually study this?
Well, they used a measure called CEO delta.
CEO delta, okay.
Which basically measures how much a CEO's compensation is tied to changes in the company's stock price.
Ah, so it's about how much their personal wealth is at stake.
Exactly. And the theory is that a lower CEO delta might mean that management is more focused on long-term stable growth.
Instead of taking big risks for short-term gains.
Right. They're incentivized to be more cautious.
That's really interesting. And what did their analysis show?
Well, it suggested that higher green innovation was linked to a lower CEO delta.
So it does seem like being seen as environmentally responsible can actually lead to more conservative decision-making at the top.
It seems that way.
Which further reduces the likelihood of financial trouble.
Right. It all fits together.
That's a fascinating connection.
Right.
Were there any other interesting findings in the research?
Yeah, there were a couple other details that stood out.
Okay.
One was that their main results held true even when they specifically excluded financial firms from their analysis.
Financial firms, so like banks and investment companies.
Exactly.
Why was that important?
Well, financial institutions operate under a very different set of regulations.
Right. They have their own whole world of rules.
They do, and including them in the analysis could have skewed the overall findings.
Ah, so they wanted to make sure the results weren't being driven by those unique factors.
Right. They wanted to focus on the broader corporate landscape.
Okay. What was the other interesting finding?
They also made sure to account for a company's overall spending on research and development.
RD.
So even after controlling for how much companies were investing in innovation in general, the specific link between green innovation and lower default risk was still significant.
So it wasn't just about being innovative in any way.
No, it seems there's something unique about innovation that's focused on the environment.
That makes it a real factor in financial stability.
That's what the research suggests.
Very cool.
Yeah.
Okay, as we wrap up this deep dive,
Yeah.
what would you say is the biggest takeaway for you from all of this research?
For me, the most compelling thing is that there's strong evidence that investing in green innovation isn't just about checking off a box or responding to pressure.
It's not just about appearances.
Right. It's a legitimate financial strategy.
Because it can actually affect a company's bottom line.
Exactly. It seems to have a real impact on reducing the risk of default.
So it's potentially good for the planet and demonstrably good for the balance sheet.
That's the ideal scenario.
Absolutely. And who should be paying attention to these findings? Who does this really matter to?
Well, this research is relevant for a lot of different people.
Okay, like who?
For company managers, it gives them a clear reason to make green innovation part of how they manage risk.
So it should be part of their strategy.
For sure. And for investors, it gives them valuable clues about which companies might be more stable and resilient.
So they can make smarter investment decisions.
Exactly. And for policymakers, it strengthens the case for supporting and encouraging green initiatives across the whole economy.
Because it can actually contribute to a more stable financial system.
Right. It's about more than just the environment.
It's about creating a more sustainable and resilient future overall.
Absolutely.
So this research really changes the conversation around sustainability. It's not just a cost or a burden anymore.
It's an opportunity.
It can be a core driver of long-term financial success.
And on resilience.
Exactly. So on that note, here's a final thought for you, our listener.
Okay, hit me.
As environmental challenges become more urgent,
they're not going away.
And as people become more aware of those challenges,
right,
could we see a future where green innovation isn't just a nice to have, but an absolute must-have for any company that wants to survive?
That's a really interesting question.
Could it become a basic requirement for long-term financial viability?
Like a non-negotiable.
Exactly. It's something to think about as you consider where to invest your money. And as you watch how companies are adapting to this changing world.
It's something all of us need to be thinking about.
For sure. The future is green.
It really seems that way.
All right. Thanks for diving into this with me.
This was great. Always a pleasure.
Until next time.